Hi, folks. So before we get started with our episode, I wanted to give a quick PSA that we have launched a brand new civic education podcast. This podcast is called Only in Santa Clara County, and it is essentially the same thing as OSJ, except for the county of Santa Clara. So if you've ever been interested in how county government works, the budget process of county government, the policy process of county government, you can find only in Santa Clara County, wherever you get your podcasts, and on YouTube. And you can also jump right down to the show notes and find the links there. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Only in San Jose, San Jose's first civic education podcast, dedicated to demystifying and democratizing the process of local government in the city of San Jose. My name is Ellina Yin, and I will be your host. Hello and welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the 2024 election coverage. And I'm gonna do this a little bit differently than prior years past, which is this episode, we are not going to specifically talk ballots. I will have, however, a resource guide that talks about different positions and different ballot measures, as well as a collection of voter guides from various community-based organizations is going to be listed in the Linktree link in the show notes. And I will be just curating great content that already exists, so I don't have to do the work of reproducing it. Yay. And so it's a collection of content that is created by local community-based organizations, as well as the Santa Clara County Office of Register of Voters. And so that will be all curated and collected in one place. And in this episode, we're going to talk about something a little bit different, but totally, I think, helping to situate us in the space and time or context of now, but in order to understand why it's so important right now to be registered and to vote in this election. We are going to go back into the past and talk about how we actually got our voting rights and the struggle and the challenges and the community organizing and the lives impacted and lost. People lost their lives fighting for these rights. And we don't really hear about that story enough. So, to facilitate that conversation, I have invited Dr. Angelica Cortez. Dr. Cortez is the founder and executive director of Lead Filipino and the Senior Vice President of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for Pacific Clinics. Dr. Cortez has been voted Silicon Valley's 40 under 40, and she is a public policy professional, DEI executive, and community organizer who has worked within policy advocacy, local politics, and health and human services across California. You can read more about Dr. Cortez in our show notes and learn more about Lead Filipino and all of those links related in our show notes. So, before we get into the conversation, I wanted to preface that this interview, this conversation that I had with Dr. Cortez was actually recorded in early July. And the time and context in which we recorded in July, early July, the the primary winner was President Joe Biden, and it was before the assassination attempts, obviously, and before President Biden stepping down. So it was in that context, before everything that we knew, and nobody obviously predicted this, but everything that we knew about the landscape of what we would be approaching during 2024 voting in November had completely flipped, had completely changed. So I invited Dr. Cortez to share a few thoughts about our conversation and about what is actually happening in this moment right now. And at the time of this recording of this introduction, it is the week of October 13th. And so, in her own words, Dr. Angelica Cortez.
If you would have told me that back in July, when we first spoke and sat down for this talk around voter rights and protections, that a mere 15 days later, the national presidential landscape as we knew it at that time would be flipped on its head to create such a seismic level of uproar and excitement and energy, being President Joe Biden announcing that he would not seek re-election. And instead, we see this emergence of Vice President Kamala Harris thrust onto the national stage, and a few weeks later, seeking the Democratic Party's nomination for the 2024 presidential bid. I would have told you that is unconscionable. There's no way it could happen in such a rapid succession and in that sequence. But you know what? It did. It happened. And I was a delegate at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The energy was electrifying. The fervor was felt. And to bear witness to this historic moment, or as I say, this historic moment, at a period of time where we're seeing such pain, such despair, both domestically and abroad, as we look at the rising humanitarian crisis in Palestine with Israel, being committed by Israel. When we see people for the first time questioning and criticizing in a way of a collective interest stemming from wanting to see not just a cessation, but a complete change in how America is conducting itself in foreign affairs, to, again, back to domestic policy, our economics, affordability, creating equal and leveling playing fields for individuals and families and communities to flourish and thrive and pursue their own form of happiness. There is this collective transfixation on what's going to happen next. We're 21 days out from the election. It's clear that one candidate will uphold our democracy as we know it. One candidate is running on the future. The other candidate wants to revert us and take us back to our past. I'm speaking purely of my own volition and of my own opinions, but that's how I'm feeling. I'm feeling like, of course, every election is consequential. This one is keeping me up at night. We are running voter turnout programs in collaborative fashion out of downtown San Jose. We're also registering voters in Vegas and in San Antonio. So in very different terrains and territories with a variety of political dynamics and philosophies that are all swirling about. I am being kept up at night. I am feeling hopeful. I am also feeling like the polls are closing in. The excitement and the fervor and the feeling that we experienced a month and a half ago now has waned. So it's really going to be, this is truly an election that we all need to watch, get involved in, and cast our vote.
Now, I wish it was otherwise, but unfortunately, I am in the same boat as Dr. Cortez in terms of losing sleep over this election, y'all. A lot is on the line, and it's not just presidential. I don't want us, especially for those of us with, fatigue at the polarization and the toxicity of our national government, who might be feeling just emotionally exhausted, maybe even voter apathy, please do not lose sight of everything that is below of what we call the down ballot, that is happening on your state level, your county level, your city or town level. Those are so, so important. And we get into the mechanisms and facets of our democracy within the context of city and county government in this conversation. So I'm really excited for y'all to hear and learn with me, alongside me, about the hard fought rights that we have, these voting rights that we have, how we got here, and how we got to the present day conditions. And so that conversation, and again, was recorded on July 3rd, early July, July 3rd timeframe. And so it was under that context. And before we get started, I just want to say that if you enjoy Only in San Jose, if you enjoy this podcast, please write us a review, hit that like and follow button, subscribe. It really does matter. And if it's within your means, you can also support us on Patreon. And so you can find all that in our show notes. Now, I really hope that you'll enjoy this conversation, that you come away from it with more hope and feeling like you have more agency and autonomy over the things that are happening in your life and to your community. And register to vote. Make sure you are registered to vote, and all of that can be found in our show notes. And now to the conversation.
Alrighty, well, hi, Ellina, and hello, OSJ listeners. Thank you for welcoming me and sharing in this space. We're going to talk about some interesting and very tantalizing topics related to voter education, history, and turning our collective attention toward the general election in November.
Yes. So before we get started, Jel, what do you want people to know about you besides what I've already shared with them on your bio?
That's always a funny question. What do I want people to know about me? I think I think first and foremost that I'm a community member, that I'm sitting here and experiencing and navigating through this society and these changes right alongside everybody else. And I'd like people to know that I'm doing the best that I can with the positions that I'm in to make changes that I feel will support the advancement, the economic prosperity, the visibility, the representation and power of communities that I work alongside and serve on a daily basis. So when I look at myself and I look at my sisters and my neighbors, these are working class people. These are individuals that are just trying to survive in a high inflation, high cost economy, and just trying to hold close what's important to them, their families, their loved ones, and enjoying life in between. I think for me, I feel the calling to serve in community spaces, to focus on uplifting the experiences that communities of color, immigrant communities, LGBTQ plus groups, how they interact with and how they are characterized in our public systems. So my way of doing that is investing my time and my resources into leadership development, into opportunities, translating our presence into power in these public systems, in community spaces, in every sector, actually, but primarily in both the public and community domains. So overall, I'd like people to know that I am a friend, sister, community member, cousin, auntie, and someone that's just trying to do what she can to contribute toward a progressive future.
I love that. And that's totally why, I thought that we would have a great conversation. Obviously, we know each other personally as friends, colleagues, collaborators, community organizers. And, this podcast is very much for the everyday working person who isn't a community organizer or isn't, a city staffer or an elected official. It's the people who are navigating in response to all of that and just trying to find their way and protect their loved one and care for their community.
That's right. Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me to the esteemed and the famed Only an SJ podcast. I've long admired the the community that you've grown, Ellina, just through a slow made, homegrown process. So I'm honored to be here.
Right back at ya. So, in your own words, what are the powers of voting and civic participation?
Absolutely. Now, I come from a school of thought of to know your history is to know yourself. And to know your history and to know yourself, right? I think equal parts studying your community, whether or not that's a cultural, a racial, an ethnic, or even a non-visible social group that you might be a part of, understanding the forebears and the legacies that have been planted that you've benefited from that predate your time. So I believe truly and strongly in those principles, but also that we as organizers, as community activists, as social workers, as cultural workers, as change makers in the public domain, that we are taking care of ourselves through reflection, introspection, and journaling. So when I think about the powers of voting and getting involved at that local root, I mean, if you look back at our history in this country, labor rights leaders, civil rights leaders, revolutionaries, visionaries, these rights had to be fought for tooth and nail. And people died. They devoted their entire lives for progress and for movement. And these rights never came from the top down. They were always fought for at that local, at that root level that is people driven and people inspired and people sustained. So when I communicate and characterize just the necessity, or depending on which demographic group I'm talking to, maybe I'm talking to the younger folks, the older folks. I have, obviously we know lesser of a struggle with the old timers, but the younger individuals that have grown disillusioned with our systems based on their own experiences, what they're choosing to believe, and the media they're consuming. And I say choosing to believe because there's many a rampant, um, you know, bouts of misinformation and disinformation flowing around in our universe. And I think the need to increase investment into media literacy to help develop critical thought around that meme that's flying through on your reels or information that's being shared via email, being skeptical, like that's okay. And to have some type of vetting process in terms of knowing your data sources. And anyhow, the powers of voting and engaging at the local level, that's where you feel the changes at the deepest and the heaviest and the highest. So for me, it always needs to start there. And then you, as you so choose, move from that locus.
I love that. And being that, it's only in San Jose, local is definitely our thing. And I've definitely heard of that, think globally, act locally. Don't know exactly where that's from, but I totally vibe with the local action because that is where we felt we have our lived experiences, and that's where we feel the most direct impact. And so you mentioned, a little bit about the rights that we have that were hard fought for. And not a lot of us, including myself, have a whole civic education on like our voter rights and like what these laws are. And so, for this first part of our conversation, we're going to be going over some key documents and really looking at what we talked about offline before we started, the landscape of our voting system. And so let's start with that and dive right in, and I'll follow your lead.
Let me apologize in advance to all the listeners that make it through or find themselves squarely listening to this episode and make it through to the end. I think for me, my Achilles heel is that I tend to overinform rather than underinform. And so what Ellina and I talked about was more so the environment and the bodies of laws and policies around voter education, access, and engagement as we think about turning our collective attention toward the general election, just the importance of, as community contributors, cultural workers, organizers, folks that work in this space that are running phone banking programs, that are recruiting canvassers, training them, door knocking, those annoying text messages you get. Yep, that's us, right? So just understanding at a high level some of the history and these, bodies of legislation, some of the gross disruptions and changes to these laws, and how that influences or manipulates how it lands on that local level. So I'm happy to walk everyone through. And again, I'm not an attorney. I'm not here interpreting what any of this means. This is just information that I'm sharing. Do your own due diligence, do your own research, right? But just at a high level, recognizing the environment that we're in, and some of that history.
I would say for those who are curious to learn more about this, we will have all of the links to each key legislation that we're talking about in our show notes. And so you can also go explore after this primer.
Yeah, and so maybe before we get into some of the history, I'll bring some of the sort of current programs that we're working on, so it helps to contextualize the additional information I'll share, the historical information. Now, I'm joining today in a personal capacity, but your girl has a couple different hustles in community, all oriented around civic engagement and increasing our community's civic literacy, doing so through culturally responsive strategies and outreach, particularly for the Filipina XO and Asian American Pacific Islander communities. And within those groups, of course, we have the intersections of LGBTQ plus community members, serving multi-generational groups. So wading through these experiences and these beliefs, these different values that all kind of converge or clash when it comes to how we see our votes and how we see our sheer numbers manifest at the polls. So now how many, I've lost count, how many voter registration programs have we run through Lead Filipino, which is the organization that I started back in late 2015, and I have the privilege of continuing to serve as the executive director. We actually started as a voter registration initiative, and that was back in late 2015 and then throughout 2016. So if I were to count a rough estimate, we ran 7 different voter registration programs. And part of the canvasser training, right, whether or not it's phone banking, we're cutting turf, we're accessing voter information to outline neighborhoods we'll be walking in as we think about our direct engagement, or even if we're popping up at different community events, we don't put any canvasser out there to interact with the public without having some type of grounding and understanding California's voter rights laws and resources, but also understanding the influences of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Yeah, we're taking it back there, everybody. I like to say that government and civics class became interesting when we actually started enlivening and living out these activities in a way where we were challenging gross underrepresentation and gross neglect of our communities in these processes in voting. So I think I saw a statistic recently that said California has such a high rate of voters that are not registered that are eligible. I think I saw a figure of 4.7 million.
Wow.
Predominantly Black, Indigenous, folks of color, BIPOC. So to me, that was just a staggering figure as someone who, has worked, several different election cycles to do our part in not only engaging canvassers, but knocking on doors, registering voters at Seafood City. Shout out to Seafood City, Jollibee, and Goldilocks. We've helped run voter registration programs in Santa Clara County as well as in LA County. In fact, I spent almost the entire summer last year in the city of Los Angeles, helping to co-lead the Asian American Voter Empowerment Project. When you think of the scorching LA heat and door knocking and asking someone if they are registered to vote, it is as dreary as it sounds, right? So part of that is understanding, I think, and maybe this is just a personal virtue, but just knowing the sacrifices and the struggle and the pain that it took to get us here. Because when I try to avoid going down my lecture paths with some of these folks, but the apathy and the disengagement and the defectors that are just like, well, I'm not voting, it just pains my heart.
Yeah, I can't imagine, because that 2015, that's almost 10 years that you've been running these campaigns. A lot has happened in the last 10 years, the last 4 years. And what I'm curious to know what you've seen over the years about voter attitudes. And, how has that changed? Is there a glimmer of hope? Or, where should we be actually focusing, based off the lived experience of running these campaigns and talking to these people for the last 10 years?
So the tricky thing, I don't want to say tricky necessarily, but you don't really get into voter attitudes until you start talking about political ideology. So, which is another tactic of why we equip our canvassers with just the history and the facts. Because when you're running a voter registration, a voter turnout initiative, you're likely at least in our circumstances, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We need to remain nonpartisan. We cannot influence in any way how the person votes. We can merely give them the resources, the tools, and the dates, and how to register and how to stay apprised of, important happenings in that process. Now, I think that when you look at I know this is based on recent voter information that has been released by policy organizations and think tanks within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, like API Data or Appia Vote, where they're looking at, survey data and information around social attitudes around housing, around healthcare, around higher education. So these issues that, touch us in so many different ways and at different points in our lives. So I'd say it's almost easier to break that question apart and go by demographic, like age groups. And of course, there are privileges too that we acknowledge. Is someone working within a community-based organization? Are they working within local government and policy and advocacy where they're ingesting this information daily? Whereas someone who is working in the service industry, or they are whatever field they're in, they're not proximal to these conversations. So I've heard comments around sort of just dismal and fatalistic around the future of this country. We also acknowledge that we are not a monolith in our political ideologies. So that definitely plays out in the Asian American community. What you see are people likely voting along their class interests. So even if, and this is another big issue in our community around, and that's why when we talk about voter rights and history, it's entirely a racial justice and equity issue. When you talk about disenfranchising and diluting a vote and drawing maps that'll completely disempower entire communities that might vote as a block or might have shared interests, which we can touch on in a bit. But everything from, I don't see I don't see my vote making a difference. My vote won't matter. This sort of collective attention on national rhetoric and politics, and then again, right, overlooking the importance and the impact of local policies and laws. So really, as cultural workers, as organizers on the ground, really helping to facilitate that trust and to bring people into these processes, especially in moments like we're living through right now, where they're, at least what the conversations we're in and the attitudes that we're facing,
Yeah.
just not excited about the options. That is not my personal opinion. I'm just saying that's what we're hearing.
Yeah, I like that you brought up demographics and honestly, the importance of disaggregated data because each demographic can be, in terms of like political ideology, not even close to each other. And a lot of that, ideology, at the end of the day it is about ideas, but why you believe in it is based off your lived experience. And there are definitely populations out there who might be more left or more right or more center, or, one of the many places that you can stand in this political spectrum. And I was just on a panel last week and we were talking about disaggregated data. And I just wanted to share, some things that I found. For the Vietnamese American community in San Jose. Um, and, San Jose has the largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam. And there are, they're one of the most interesting in terms of they do vote differently from the rest of Asian Americans, but that is also further bifurcated or, broken apart by generation. So the generations do not vote the same. And this is, I think you had mentioned like Appia voter data. And so, 79% of Vietnamese Americans do not get their news from regular news media channels or papers. And then we get into, if we were talking about Reddit, Twitter, WhatsApp, TikTok, LinkedIn, 89% do not engage with that. And then there's only 44% engage on Facebook, and 51% get most of their news information from YouTube. And that's just the Vietnamese American population. And it gets, like, wildly different and also, specific about each, demographic through the APIA voter data, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. But as you were talking about, demographics, that was just something that definitely, popped up because I learned those stats recently, and they've only started collecting it recently. Which is, we have a lot more data now than we did 4 years ago.
Which taps back onto my earlier point around the urgency to really up our ante and develop accessible and easily digestible learning material around media literacy. How are you vetting the influencer that you're listening to and taking your cues from? When I think of influencers, I mean, no disrespect, we all are spreading a certain dogma, right? You opened up your episode today asking me how I want people to know and regard me. We're all carrying our own, right, pathos and dogma. So you have these influencers that have created their public personas around perhaps fashion, elements of culture, foodies and being food critics, movie critics. You have beauty and skincare. And when you think of YouTube as, that's wild. I know you're only highlighting just one community, and I'd be curious to look at the rest of that report. But influencers, me chat, these different Reddit threads, you have folks that still tap into X and how they're, kind of blindly following some of these social media accounts, and you're not sure who's necessarily running them. These phantom accounts where you are not questioning them, and we are not equipping our people with any type of like method. Now, if I see this meme, if I see this, seemingly the way it's presented to me, some fact sheet, right? Where did they get this information? Who funded the research? Who are their primary and secondary sources? How did they validate this information? Is it reliable? Is this just someone's commentary? And suddenly the commentary of someone's own personal biases has now, created such a wave and a tide that we're just taking this as gospel and this is truth. We see that happening all the time, and just the carelessness of lying, like the recklessness of straight up lying, but delivering it in a way where you're confident and convicted. And that just being dangerous too.
Yeah, there is definitely a lot on the social media influencers, but also like newer news networks that aren't actually news networks, but they copy the aesthetics that we have been used to watching the last 20 years on ABC, NBC, whatever, CNN, Fox. So they present as professional, legitimate news. I have family members that watch these channels not knowing any better. Um, and there aren't often a lot of conversations of like cite your source or where did you get that information from, who was it done by. And I think that really, like, the only time I remember learning about checking your sources was in high school when I was learning to write essays and like citing my all my citations. And I feel like we probably should do a misinformation, disinformation podcast episode. That'll be another one. But thank you. Thank you for bringing that up because that is absolutely a part of the landscape and the ecosystem that affects all of this work that we're talking about.
Like the deeper philosophical question too, and this is not me taking aim at any one media organization or any one influencer or any one celebrity, anyone that has a platform, right? Obviously, the bigger you are, the principle is the more responsibility you wield with what you're pushing out there, how you're throwing your influence around, what you are, channeling, the viewership that you have, and the membership that you have toward positive change. Or, how are you, standing in that conductor seat and the responsibility that you have. And there is a right and a wrong answer there, right? The philosophical question of, or maybe it's just a practical question of, when your example, when you think about the methodology of piecing together just a basic research paper, how you're structuring your argument, how you're presenting your evidence, how you are citing your sources and validating that they're based in fact in some type of inquiry and some type of study. You take just those steps and you apply it to any type of profession, vocation, occupation, right? And it's not to be exclusive. It's to say, I'm a studied person. I've gone through the rigors of some type of methodology, some type of process, some type of discipline to say that on the other end, I have credibility, I have legitimacy because I am practiced, I am studied, and all of these things. So how do we get there quicker for the general public, right? And I'm very curious about how you might approach the misinformation and disinformation conversation, because we need help on that side.
Yeah, I think there's definitely media literacy is a great place to start. And just like definitions is how we actually started off. The panel was called, media literacy on disinformation. And I'm reminded of Brene Brown. She had said this quote is in her Atlas of the Heart HBO series. And she, in there, she's talking about like humans biologically, like this is lizard brain stuff, that we are inclined to believe what we see with our own eyes. Because if we see clouds, that's rain, that's a water source, that's life or death. If we see fires, it's just a natural instinct. But with the advent of television and commercials and all this stuff, being constantly bombarded by an image, even though you may think that you know it's fake, it's not real, like you're watching a television show or whatever, and you know it's over exaggerated. But when you see it like 100 times, that's how you begin to build unconscious bias and start building like these bodily reactions that just come out of nowhere that you don't really stop to think about because we're always doing so much these days. And there's definitely something about being constantly exposed to, for example, that not news organization that I know some people in my circle are watching.
That's right. I mean, your point around the evolution and the development, and then eventually the maintenance of the unconscious bias or the confirmation bias, right? Where you're creating an echo chamber around yourself and you're taking your truth to generalize it across everyone else's experiences. So there's your experience, and then there's the truth, where you're looking at inquiry, you're looking at polling, you're looking at studies where you're taking statistical data and you're applying all types of like regressive analyses across that to come up with whatever the truth is in that context. And, so the dangers of applying your truth and generalizing it to an entire community, a racial group, society, country, that's dangerous. We have a lot of people that are just throwing around their own stories and experiences and raising them up as validated truth.
Yeah, and I think too a lot of, when we talk about um placing our lens on everybody else as this is the be all end all, this is the truth, and not recognizing that each of us come from a unique lived experience. Whether you are an eldest, youngest, only child, female presenting, male presenting, your zip code, all the things that happen to you shape your perception and how you interpret the world. And it's almost impossible to like take that off because it is just a very difficult thing, but you can be aware of it. And we've definitely, I think, lack in a culture where we don't have that awareness very well developed anymore. But I definitely see thankfully, the younger generation, really stepping into that journey of teaching themselves self-awareness among their peers and what's going on. And so there are many movements happening within that. But I just wanted to kind of further affirm what you had said about, our lived experience and our perspectives, and really understanding that every other alive, living human being has their own.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us back to when we talk about the cultivating that mutual respect, where I don't need to necessarily have lived in your experience. I can empathize, I can be compassionate, and I can recognize that my approach is but one of many to exist and thrive, because I'm hoping everybody's thriving and not just surviving in this society. And when we talk about that protection of our democracy and our forebears fighting for these privileges, these rights that we have, and door knocking and phone banking and having our text messages ignored, right? And people not answering their phones anymore. And almost when we ask someone if they're registered to vote, if we're met with eye rolls or this like, I'll get around to it, like this sort of lazy responses, or sometimes we're met with emphatic and excited yeses, and I can't wait, right? So you're met with a range of reactions. And at least I get it. I'm not here to impose my views on others, but I am involved kind of at a deeper level in helping to communicate the importance of involvement in voting. And I have been at this for a while. And I think about friends that I have in Southeast Asian countries, and we're connected on social media. We follow each other's posts and different societal happenings and their own shock and surprise around how much information, I'll share or, others in the States share about getting out the vote. A get out the vote campaign in their context is like totally radical and out of this world. They found out about their elections. I think she told me they found out about their elections for their members of, now what was it? Was it their prime minister or their members of parliament? One of the two, like the same day.
Wow.
This was back in 2016.
That's not that far. Yeah. Yeah. And I've been to other countries where I've experienced clearly there is no freedom of the press. And voting is there's coercion, there's a lot of things that go on outside of the United States that I have bear witness to. And not to be cliche, but like it definitely is like, wow, we have so much in the United States. And whenever I do hear like, "Oh, my vote doesn't matter," my heart breaks a little too. And I just felt like, what stories have you been consuming that made you believe that? That made you believe that and give up your agency and autonomy to do anything about your life and your community? Those are sad stories, um, that a lot of us are subjected to because, like you had mentioned earlier, like, California, we have a huge number of people who are eligible and not registered.
Yeah, and so this despondence, this disengagement, it's heavily personal. And to your point around coercion, intimidation, like violence, so different, subversive tactics. But everything I just described happens in California still, happens in this country still. And we have friends that are in another county. I won't throw this county in. Actually, I will. San Joaquin County, do better. They were poll monitors in the recent primary election. And so I reached out to them and I asked, how are you doing? What are you doing around the general election? And they said, we're tapping out. They're leaders in a community-based organization in San Joaquin County. And they said, we're tapping out because our volunteers, as we were monitoring polls, were bullied, they were insulted, they were fearful for their physical safety. And this is happening in California.
There's so much that happens in California that you would think, "Not here," and I was like, "Not in your local newspaper, but it's happening."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so if we zoom out, right? So earlier I talked about we're not putting any canvasser out at a community festival or at any event in front of Jollibee or Seafood City without having a firm grounding in what it took to get us here. And this is just my hope at igniting some type of flame that they have to enact, right, their civic leadership. But going back to what I said earlier, to know your history is to know thyself. So the study of thyself, the same idea of understanding the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and what that meant in our context in the United States. And it was the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that gave citizens of every race and color equal rights to make contracts, purchases, hold and dispose of property, and enjoy the full and equal benefits of all laws. Of course, this act was continuously challenged by racist and discriminatory white Americans that did not want to, because when you also look at the act and the amendments that it introduced and ratified into our Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And we teach our canvassers about the position and the importance of the 14th Amendment today in the 21st century. So the 13th Amendment, giving equal protection to all citizens under the law. The 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to African Americans and slaves who had been emancipated after the American Civil War. and including them under the umbrella phrase of all persons born or naturalized in the United States. And then the 15th Amendment specifically calling out Black African American males being given the right to vote. So when we talk about the elimination and the erosion and hence the protection of civil rights, we need to bring it back that far. And when you sort of are represented voter rights and access and how this is entirely a racial justice and equity issue, people listen a little differently.
Yeah. And I also want, our listeners to understand the life and death importance of being recognized by the law. If you're not recognized, you're essentially like not a person in the eyes of the legal system. You're not worth protecting. You have no means to move up economically, and you are left quite vulnerable, physically. And with, a swipe of a pen, wand, whatever you want to call it, I always, say that, what we write down and what becomes our laws is almost an act of magic because, you say a few words, you write a few words, and all of a sudden, all of these people that were once invisible, not considered part of this constitution, part of this, republic, all of a sudden, they're here and they are protected by these laws. And again, as you had mentioned, it didn't just come of the goodwill of the legislators in that time. It came from the ground up people fighting for those rights.
People fighting, people resisting, people losing their lives. And so when I met with an individual of any age where they think the solution right now is to disengage, I'm like, this is the time to step right in. This is the time to step right in because the stakes are high. And it feels like I'm saying that. It feels like I've said that every election. I'm not trying to be like dramatic, but damn it, I was saying this in 2016 and it was true. And I said it in 2020, and here we are, 2024. The stakes are high. We need to protect our democracy.
Mhm. So, right now, where we are in our little history lesson, we've got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And this is basically the foundational structure of the voting system that has enabled us to present day. But it's not just that, there's also more to it.
Yeah. So, and I'm giving you broad strokes here. Now, if anyone's so interested in a deeper, intimate conversation with yours truly, I welcome that opportunity. But you start to see in this, despite the passage of this, well, first you had, right, the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, all enslaved Black Americans now free. And then you have this Reconstruction period, that angst and that tension with the Southern states, believing that slave ownership were their state rights. Those are always triggering words for me when I hear state rights, personally. And then you have the enactment of these amendments, right? What do you also have that comes parallel to that? You have separate but equal. You have Jim Crow laws. You have the segregated South. And when we talk about voter subversion and suppression, intimidation, you have literacy tests that suddenly came out of the woodwork, right? For Black voters, literacy tests, you have grandfather clauses where if your grandfather didn't vote, then you are ineligible to vote. And we know that as, formerly enslaved Black Americans, their grandfathers, their forebears did not vote. So you see all of these egregious, activities and just maneuvers that are evil to continue excluding, right? How you said, if you are not visible and present and seen in the law, then you are invisibilized.
And that is life and death.
And that is life and death.
Yeah. I also I appreciate that you had mentioned like the Reconstruction period because I think that is an important footnote to highlight is like so we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And they were passed in the 1860s. And but and this is where I feel like there definitely should be more civic education around the law because it doesn't mean like it happened and everybody got rights. Now we actually have to construct these systems that will enable more people to vote. And then you think about, late 19th century, who were those people in office? Who were those administrators designing all of these new systems as supposed to be more equal, more fair, and inclusive? And think about those people. And this is not like pointing a finger saying like they're all the bad guys or anything like that. But this is highlighting their lived experience, their perspective. How would they know what the challenges are or what they would be for people voting for the first time? And are they thinking from like a compassionate design perspective of how to register people? Like none of that wasn't and that was definitely that lived experience was definitely missing when they were implementing all of these laws, which is why we are going to be talking about some other laws that came after that to do more. But that is something that I really want people to understand is like just because a law has passed and like the president signed it, that's like step one. That's like me declaring I want to become a lawyer at 18. And well, now I got to go to law school and I have to pass the bar exam. I have to do all of these steps to become that thing. When we talk about at least the national federal levels of law, that's as ideological as you can get. And then local government is where rubber meets the road, is where things are implemented and how it actually manifests in real life.
Yeah, and I'd like to tap back in a few minutes on when we talk about bringing into focus the importance of local governments, because these cities, right, that have been incorporated and have had charters that have been active, alive, and well for 125 plus years, we need to reapply. We need to revisit those charters and apply a racial equity and justice lens to those charters and those governance principles. But we'll get back into that in a sec because I'm still taking everyone through and back to their econ and civics class from high school, but with my own spin and my own twist. Okay, everybody.
Yes.
So, here we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right, which ended Jim Crow laws that recognized Black African American men as 3/5 of a man, and created all types of other systemic barriers around home ownership, accessing business loans, the opportunities to create generational wealth, land ownership. So I have my own set of opinions on how we've seen the damages and the gross disparities in income inequality that we see till this day. I know that I'm preaching to the choir on that. But the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is where I think our general American consciousness sort of starts that civil rights conversation. But I think it's important that we stretch back 161 years ago and we talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Like you said, really introducing that infrastructure and saying we have equal protection under the law. And Black African American men can vote. But then we continue across almost another 100 years to see Jim Crow laws from coast to coast.
Which started in a local level.
That's right. Voter suppression, voter subversion, intimidation, coercion, bullying, violent acts. That's a whole other set of chapters. But the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, ruling that separate but equals unconstitutional. So opening equal access to now restaurants, public transportation, other public facilities, the introduction of equal employment opportunity protections in the workplace, affirmative action laws that would come on the heels of this major, legislative package, and diversifying our workforces. leveling the playing field to enable access to economic opportunity and prosperity, women in the workplace, right? And breaking down those barriers for ethnic and racial minorities to now be able to realize their own version of this American dream, which my mind's sort of shifting on what American dream means these days, anyhow. But then that moves us into a year later. President Lyndon B. Johnson would sign into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, when you think about, a key and a core civil rights piece, most people are talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then you have the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 as well. But this law, the Voting Rights Act, outlawing the discriminatory voting practices that we talked about, that had been adopted in these southern states, and they've gone real comfortable at that point, and bold in their egregious activities and practices, because they had adopted a lot of, right, when we talk about literacy tests and grandfather clauses and other subversive tactics right after the Civil War. And so combusting that, pulling that apart, and the Voting Rights Act being the most significant statutory change in the relationship between the federal and state governments in the area of voting since the Reconstruction period following the Civil War.
Because the Voting Rights Act, would you correct me if I'm wrong, is about more of the implementation process, what is fair and unfair, and the, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they were, I would maybe describe that as like ideological and, our values, what we believe in, but it didn't quite define implementation.
That's right. That's my interpretation as well. So it outlawed these discriminatory practices that had gone unchecked and had run rampant for almost a century, which is wild, right?
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
the Voting Rights Act had an immediate impact. So by the end of 1965, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered. And another provision within the Voting Rights Act, it created what they called the appointment of federal examiners. So federal examiners, being this third party of sorts, retaining the power to register qualified citizens to vote. So say the local elections official was super racist and bigoted and mad and decided, right, voting's only going to happen from, 8 a.m. to noon, right? Which is still an issue today when we talk about inaccessible schedules and timings of local government and committee and commission meetings. So federal examiners also having the power to keep these local officials in check and ensure that the law was being implemented to fidelity. And the other piece that I want to tap on real quick with the Voting Rights Act is Section 5. And Section 5 basically laid out, wait, hang on, I wanted to finish this thought on the immediate impact of the Voting Rights Act. So by the end of 1965, again, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered, and 1/3 of them by these federal examiners. And by the end of 1966, only 4 out of the 13 Southern states had fewer than 50% of Black African Americans registered to vote.
Wow.
And there's a piece within the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, where it talks about pre-clearance. Have you heard of this?
Mm-mm.
So pre-clearance was basically President Johnson's, his whole "I see you" to the Southern states that were extremely discriminatory, and right, he's like, "I see you. Anytime you want to change anything about your elections because you have such a seedy history with discriminatory voting practices, especially excluding and disenfranchising Black African American voting power, you will need to seek and receive pre-clearance if you want to make any changes with your local, or state elections or your state, electoral laws and whatnot. Now, you feel triumphant hearing that, right? Like it's this particular call out for states that have punitive histories. But in 2013, a Supreme Court ruling hollowed out that piece of Section 5, where pre-clearance was to be maintained, and states that have this history, this demonstrated history, would need to seek that. So that is no longer, that was basically gutted and eliminated through the Shelby decision in 2013.
So what I'm hearing, and I'm just kind of thinking in comparison to like 13th, 14th Amendment, um, there were things that were maybe implicit but not explicitly written and clarified on. And then we have a key piece of legislation, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is very, very implicit and explicit, going back to Section 5. And the difference of how many people were registered vote and voting during the late 19th century to what you were saying, you're giving the statistics of, the percentage, so quarter million more Black men voting. And that is the power of a good, well thought out law.
Yeah.
And this isn't Lyndon B. Johnson's Gold Star hymn. It is people fought for this. They
That's
pushed
right.
it up there. They went community organizing. They was like, no, we need to have Section 5, put it in there. And that is like the civic participation aspect outside of the voter as being civic engagement. And that is extremely powerful. And we're seeing, other Supreme Court decision rulings going after, line item by line item, these specific line items. And in the classes that I teach, I go with the quote that most people realize or are familiar with is like the devil's in the details. And I was like, no. Power is in the details. And to access that power, you have to go into the details.
And the power, right, is inserted, it's manipulated, it's sort of like the properties of water, right? It can be vapor, it can be a solid, it could be a liquid, especially embedded in budgets and the weaponization of budgets.
Oh, yes.
Government
This fund
budgets.
can only be used for this on this date with this special vote.
Or earmarks, or encumbering your funds, or reallocations, right? So power is in the person who owns the means of production and who holds the purse strings. And to go back to your point, because I think we should emphasize this together and keep weaving this thread of the nature and the history, like the regal history of the Black African American community as not just a visionary group, but also, of course, a resilient group, but that laid the foundation as we think of communities of color that came in other immigration waves in the years following, right? The adoption of the Naturalization and Immigration Act, which, opened up and increased our racial and ethnic diversity of the country. But right when this period where Jim Crow laws were, firmly and fully planted, groups like the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, emerging as a response to that, to create spaces and places where groups, Black African American communities, could process together, seek safety together, but realize, right, their civic base and their power, despite being confronting barriers and challenges after challenges. So I wanted to just tap on that. Now, as we think about kind of zooming into California, and we narrow in on just the importance of the time we're finding ourselves in. I know that we want to touch upon the consequences and what's at stake and truly what's on the ballot this November. You think about California, the state that we're in. And let me just preface this, everyone, by saying I know that California is a different world. Everyone lives within their own contexts and within their own environments, right? So this piece that I'm about to share is specific to California voting rights. So I'll talk about the California Voting Rights Act of 2001, which, as I read it, I would characterize it as it extends and goes further in on protecting against voter suppression and disenfranchising community groups in how they vote. So I'll talk about that. And then the Voter Choice Act, which is the California Voter Choice Act that was passed in 2016. We currently have 19 of our 58 counties that are participating in the VCA. So I'll talk a little bit about that too, just in terms of how our state has and continues to make deep investments in widening voter access and deepening voter awareness. So I'm happy to kind of take us in any one direction, but I want to give you a second.
Yeah, let's go back to 2001.
Can we take it back to 2001? And why I think this is important is it's a lesser known act, but I've seen two lawsuits now. I'll only talk about one where the California Voting Rights Act did its job. Okay. So passed in 2001. This is only relevant in California, y'all, but it makes it easier for racial and ethnic minority groups in California to prove that their votes are being diluted in at-large elections. And so it expanded upon the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. So another way to say that is when you think of a city that has 100,000, 200,000, 500,000 residents, and when we say they're elected by at large, right? So if I'm a resident in that city and I'm looking at my ballot, because I'm showing up on election day, y'all, and I'm voting for my council members, it means you're voting and you're electing your council members the same way you'd elect your mayor or the same way you'd elect your governor, where you're looking at them like 12 names and you're like, I don't know any of them. I'm just reading their little description. This person's a teacher. This person's a nonprofit advocate. This person's an attorney, small business owner, former veteran, whatever their description is. And you're just marking on that ballot who you're voting for. At large means they could live anywhere in your city that might run 60 miles each direction. What some of the instigators and some of the realities that inspired the California Voting Rights Act is that we started to see, I'm saying we like I was actually active in doing things like this in 2001, but our forebears that have been doing this work as civil rights activists and advocates for years started to see that in at-large elections, you were seeing that elected representatives might have only been coming from the affluent areas in that city, the wealthy areas of the city, all white, despite having a majority population of communities of color, a minority majority population. When you're electing at large, who's more likely to turn out to vote, right? Let's just kind of zoom out and look at some of these statistics that we know are true, that are corroborated and substantiated every single election cycle. We know that the wealthy and affluent classes, the older classes of people, show up to vote. We know that we have challenges with turnout with younger individuals or the working poor and the working classes that are at work, that are overemployed, juggling 2 to 3 jobs, just trying to pay their bills and get by in this world, and they're not showing up at the polls. So at-large elections started creating these realities of all white city councils, all white mayors that were what? Not reflective of the communities they were serving, not living the experiences of the people they were creating laws and policies and passing budgets for, but instead reading about their realities. There's a difference. And the California Voting Rights Act really being one of the, again, instigating pieces that led to what we now have as district-based elections. So I like to point to the city of San Jose when they introduced and revised their charter in the late 60s, early 70s to enact district-based elections. That's when you saw the first Vietnamese American elected to city council for the 10th largest, now 12th largest city in the country. That's when you saw many first. The first Latino, the first Latina from East Side San Jose elected to serve on our city council. So the California Voting Rights Act definitely being an added layer to strengthen this federal law, the voting rights law. And so the other story where I've seen this in action, the California Voting Rights Act, is with the city of Santa Clara, who everything I just described, they were guilty of. So they had been incorporated as a city for like 124 years or some odd, time like that. And repeatedly, despite having a 42% Asian population, had never seen an Asian American elected to their city council. Guess where all their council members and mayor were from? They're from like the ritzy part of the city. But again, passing and setting policies and creating budgets and wheeling and dealing, for their entire city, but having not even driven to, the parts of Asian American communities, minority communities. So the city of Santa Clara was sued in 2018, and it took over 3.5 years for the Superior Court in the county to confirm that they were actually in direct violation of the California Voting Rights Act. And by not having district-based elections, they were diluting the Asian vote. And guess what? When they converted to district-based elections, they have 3 Asians on their city council as we speak.
And that would have been 2018 is when they got sued.
And then 2021 leading into 2022 is when the ruling came down.
Wow.
And they had to make those changes like that.
Y'all, this was like yesterday.
And that's like not just a recent, but like a local example, because that's in our neighborhood.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for sharing that example.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'll just kind of talk real quickly about the Voter Choice Act. So California, we're always going to do the most, everybody. That's right. But we're doing the most in a way where it is morally imperative. We have a lot of evidence that suggests that these laws are doing exactly what they were designed to do because of bad actors, because of discriminatory, exclusionary voting practices that are still existent in this state. So the Voter Choice Act was passed in 2016. There's also a new one, but really designed to expand their elections models to be more accessible and allow greater flexibility and convenience for voters. So mailing every voter a ballot, producing ballots in Spanish, Punjabi, or Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean. I saw Khmer on there.
Yeah, it's on there. I actually picked up a primary booklet this year.
In Tagalog. Yeah. Expanding in-person early voting, allowing voters to cast a ballot at any vote center within their county, and providing a secure ballot drop-off location, like multiple options throughout the county. And this passage of the VCA aligns right with when Lead Filipino hosted our first Get Out the Vote initiative. So we were a part of the pilot when there were only 11 counties that were participating in this expansion. And I think now Santa Clara County has like at least 30 different voting centers where they're partnering, right? So they call out the innovation of the partnerships with schools, with libraries, community-based organizations could actually be polling centers. So we were looking at doing that for Lead Filipino, but the VCA also requiring each participating county, as I mentioned, there are now 19 of the 58 counties participating, but for counties that are participants, they need to create an election administration plan, an EAP, through a process of public input and public hearings. And the EAP must describe how the county will administer their elections under the VCA and include their plans to educate and outreach to the public. They also need to translate their EAP into all languages that have been assigned to them by the California Secretary of State based on population data and racial and ethnic demographics. So I thought that was nifty and wanted to share that.
Yeah, going over, this history, has definitely it reminds me of the Martin Luther King line, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. And I know that we've definitely have some losses in there, but the overall arc from from 1866 to the last one in 2016 has been dialing down on more details, more structure around implementation. And when we talk about racial and social justice, where it happens most often is in the details that have been left murky. And, they might be termed, we might hear them as microaggressions or, passive, whatever. But that's what that is when you're building all of these invisible barriers, where it's impacting other people, but it's not impacting you. So it's literally invisible to you. And it's the people who started to see themselves, know thyself, see themselves, and really start to fight for themselves and their community to give us these rights.
Yep. All of that.
All right, y'all. So that is a wrap for part 1 of this conversation. Head over to episode 30 for part 2, where we get into a little bit more nuance in terms of what is actually on and happening at the local level here in the city of San Jose, the county of Santa Clara, and the state of California. And again, if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a review, write us a review, follow and subscribe. We are now on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much, and until next time.